and welcome everyone again to this morning's webinar. So as Anna's just explained, the next 15-20 minutes I'll be talking about knowledge management in the digital age, both in generic sense and then moving on to how it is reflected in our new updated CC and how that can help you get better at KM in your organisation. Just in case you're wondering, this slide is a picture of our new building. So to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about today, first of all, I'm just going to briefly cover the important question of why manage knowledge in the first place, just to provide an introduction and make sure that we have a shared understanding of the importance of KM. Secondly, I'm going to be looking at what I perceived to be, based on our research, the key changes in the knowledge management KM environment. And then we'll be looking at a summary of the new knowledge management CC, and we'll give you some highlights and insights into how we responded to those changes to make sure that the CC is relevant to your needs. And finally, we'll be looking at what are the benefits of KM for your organisation. So what can we hope to gain if we get better at managing KM? So first of all, to start with the question of why manage knowledge in the first place. As we're all aware, people have been discussing knowledge for many thousands of years. Many great philosophers with many great insights and wisdom for us to learn from. But as Socrates is saying here, know thyself, and although that's very good advice on an individual level, in organisations we need to do more than that. We need to be able to manage knowledge that individuals have in a collective way and focus towards our organisation's strategic objectives. We can't just do it in an ad hoc way based on people's individual knowledge and their insights. That's just to give an overview of why it is important to manage knowledge rather than just hope it will all work out, because people generally do know stuff, but the question is, how do we harness that for our benefits? So knowledge management is a very important aspect to this whole new trend or reality of digital transformation for organisations. So if organisations want to survive in the current environment, in many cases they will need to undergo some kind of transformation, and digital will be a key part of that. But in this fast-changing and increasingly competitive environment, it's clearly very important for organisations to know what is happening, to actually have an understanding of what's going on in the environment. This gives the organisation at least a good chance of making informed choices to anticipate and respond to those changes. So the aim would be here, then, rather than just passively being buffeted by waves of change, that because one has got a good KM strategy, one can anticipate what's coming at least some of the time and and meet those challenges in a ready and meaningful fashion. Knowledge is incredibly important in this whole enterprise. The use of technology to manage, communicate and enhance knowledge is increasingly important, and we have increasingly new capabilities and techniques in that technology. We also need to be able to share knowledge and use knowledge for advantage. So again, have mechanisms in place, so yes, we can share knowledge, but we make sure that knowledge is harnessed to actually generate, for example, new products, improved products, new services, or to anticipate a strategic change in direction due to changes that are happening in the environment. So in terms of where we've got data for our updates for our KM personal capability, we did quite a lot of standard desk research looking at the literature, both academic and practitioner. Again, as I've already highlighted, it's becoming very clear that KM is crucial in the digital environment. We also have been having feedback from members in various different engagements, and the strong message from those events and interchanges that KM is now increasingly enterprise-wide. It's quite rare to have an individual KM department or even perhaps a KM personnel, but it's more integrated into other functions. This has positive and potentially negative aspects in terms of it can be dispersed and therefore there's no clear responsibility. IT, as we're all aware, has been developing in an increasingly fast pace of change, and that has a potential role in KM, both in enabling communication and knowledge transfer. And finally, very importantly, there's becoming increasingly awareness of the social and learning aspects of KM. So again, the shift from the concept of learning organisations to organisational learning. So how can we have organisational structures and mechanisms in place to enable people to learn and to apply that learning in the workplace? And just to reiterate, as Anna mentioned, the previous version of the CC was called Knowledge Asset Management, and part of the reason that we did change that was to show in the title of the CC the importance of this social and people aspect of KM, as well as the assets. Not that the assets aren't important, but they're only part of the bigger picture. So in this slide, I'd like to cover the whole question of what has really changed in knowledge management. Of course, we always are told that we're in a very fast-changing environment and everything's completely revolutionised. To some extent that's true, but also there's clearly some constants that are still valid and have been for many years. So I think it's certainly fair to say that technology has enabled changes in the quantity. There's large amounts of data and information potentially feeding into knowledge that weren't there before. The ability to communicate that quickly, or at least to transfer it, is certainly improved. There's now new or improved methods, rather, shall we say, of analysis of large amounts of data that can sometimes lead to knowledge insights, and the speed at which all these things can happen has really accelerated. Given all of those changes, clearly people really haven't particularly changed that much, and in terms of making knowledge useful, people still need to be able to absorb it, learn from it, and to find it meaningful. So just because knowledge can be transferred in large quantities very quickly between different departments or between different global enterprises doesn't necessarily mean that the people are going to actually be able to absorb it or learn from it. And finally, and very importantly, people still need to translate it into some kind of action and innovation. So just knowing stuff is not enough. There has to be some way for that to be utilised and to actually benefit the organisation. And perhaps one example that I'd like to just highlight here, based on the work of our colleagues here at IVI in the Smart Cities project, is that in terms of smart cities and the amount of data that cities now have available to them in terms of traffic flow, traffic density, in terms of actually using that data to make a meaningful insights into city planning, there's clearly still a need for policy and planning experts to analyse that data in the correct way, and also have political priorities such as, for example, the safety of cyclists and pedestrians. That the data in itself will not make those things happen. It can only be a start for people to start to make the correct decisions. So I've highlighted here down to 5. I mean, there clearly are more, but I think this is the 5 ones that we're going to focus on today, and they are the most important. They're also roughly in order of importance, though the order will depend on the organisation to an extent. So I'll just go through these, and then we will be going through these in more detail one by one and showing how they can best be responded to in terms of improving your KM capability. So firstly, and this is nearly always the most important, we start with the enterprise-wide knowledge strategy. This is something that organisations need to get right. Secondly, we acknowledge and deal with the speed of learning and absorption that needs to happen in organisations. Thirdly, we look at the data sources and analytical tools. We need to get that right. Fourthly, relationships and communication are increasingly important, and we need to be able to develop good relationships and make sure communication flows are correct. And finally, to an extent, last but not least, in many ways, tools and technologies, we need to make sure they are enabling all of the things above, and that we're using the right ones in the right way to get us to where we need it to be in terms of KM and our organisation. So I'll start with what is the most important one, strategy. So this is the issue that now we need an enterprise-wide knowledge strategy. And I would just like to share with people in this webinar that in all the feedback that we gained developing this CC, we had a number of different experts from academic and practitioner organisations providing comments. The universal agreement that this was the most important thing for organisations to get right. There's clear research data on this, and those that work in the field are also equally clear on it. So I think that's useful to share that insight with participants today. Anyway, it's incredibly important that the knowledge strategy effectively supports and reflects the wider organisational strategy. And the key thing here is that whatever KM strategy or approach you take, there's no particular right or wrong, but it must suit the context of the organisation. For example, a fast-moving global company might will have different knowledge requirements than a school or a small voluntary organisation. So in all those cases, the organisation's strategy needs to be understood and taken into account, and the knowledge strategy has to effectively support it. And whatever the strategy is, as well as being appropriate to the organisation, it must have some mechanism or acknowledgement of the importance of transferring knowledge to appropriate action, so that benefits actually do arise. Strong relationships are very important, and effective mechanisms and structures need to be in place to facilitate communication and cooperation. Again, this is all sort of reflecting the fact that it's now an organisational-wide effort, and subsequently resources and commitment need to go into developing organisational-wide relationships. So yeah, KM must be an enterprise-wide activity, and certainly cannot be relegated to a small part of the organisation. So the second change or development that I'll be looking at is this question of learning and absorption, the fact that the speed of this has increased, and how can we best really respond to that as an organisational point of view. Now, again, looking at the research and talking to our practitioners that we engage with during this development, a key thing that came out was the importance of the organisational culture supporting knowledge and learning as a strategic priority. Unless this is in place, it's very difficult for resources and commitment to be effectively directed towards learning and knowledge. I've highlighted here the absolutely seminal paper by Cohen and Leventhal in 1990, Absorptive Capacity, a New Perspective on Learning and Innovation. In their work, they were clearly given the data publication. They were looking at companies during the late 1980s, and their conclusion was from all the companies that they looked at that once companies stopped investing in research and development or in outward-looking new knowledge activities, they basically never caught up. There was no chance of catching up. Once you hadn't done it for a couple of years, you were out of the race. So I think it's fairly safe to conclude that if that was true in the late 1980s, then it's almost certainly even more true now. So not only is it important to get this culture right, but it's important to maintain it and not to have any lapses. It must be a strategic priority for the organisation, with visible and proactive, ongoing and committed senior leadership support. And if all these things are in place, then learning and knowledge will be supported, and employees have a good chance of learning and absorbing the new knowledge that they need. So the third sort of development that I'd like to cover, which is perhaps the one that in some ways gets the most press, so to speak, is this whole issue of knowledge analysis, data sources and analytical tools, sometimes known as big data, which is perhaps the most common way of looking at it. And there's different views about how much this is really new. Is it just hype based on existing statistical models? And there's some truth in both of those. But there's certainly no doubt that there are improved methods, if not necessarily completely new, of analysing large amounts of data in ways that can really sometimes now provide new knowledge and insights. So in my view, this is something that has changed. The traditional relationship between data and information and knowledge has become slightly blurred, just because the amounts of data that we can now access and analyse, it's possible for these, with the right input and the right questions, to provide sense-making and knowledge and insights for companies rather than just a pure mass of data. This again has the implications for relationship management, because often, or traditionally, data processing, information management and knowledge management were perhaps done by quite different types of people in the organisation in different locations with different skill sets. And we now need to make sure they're all talking to each other and that their skill sets are at least integrated enough so they can make sense of what each other is saying. And finally, as I did stress in the smart cities example, it's incredibly important to be able to ask the right questions of the data. So people need to have an understanding not only of the raw data, but of the context, both scientific, political and policy, in which it will actually be used to make sure that they're asking the right questions. So the fourth area that I'd like to look at this morning is this whole area of relationships and people. Again, this is one area that hasn't, in some ways, hasn't particularly changed. It just needs to be managed in a more effective and perhaps slightly different way. There's now sort of a broader range of stakeholders in KM, both out with and within the organisation. One example of this in terms of science is the increasing development of citizen science, where members of the public are collecting data on, for example, things like bird migration and that kind of thing. So that means that scientific organisations need to be able to manage that data and the people who are collecting it in a way which respects both the quality of the data and also the need to keep people on board. So yeah, it's very important to develop effective and creative relationship management and to be perhaps more outward looking and not look at just traditional sources, but also be aware there might be potential or emerging sources of knowledge from new stakeholders. So to summarise, the approach here should be proactive engagement, so looking out and seeing who might be a good person to connect with, and developing that relationship, and to have an ongoing approach to coordinate and collaborate. So now we'll turn to what is really the final big change that we're going to be looking at, or the final development, tools and technologies. So this is really the IT focus side of it to an extent. And there are new technologies, again, new and or improved, particularly with social functionality, and that can help organisations really support the learning and cooperation and relationship management that we've been talking about so far. And one thing we would say at IVI is that it's important to critically and actively engage in these new technologies rather than just to use the latest thing, and I think this is equally true of KM. So some will be useful and some will be less so, and again, like the strategy point, it has to be appropriate for the needs of the organisation. But there is no doubt, talking to practitioners and looking at the data, that these new improved tools have provided the opportunity for KM activities such as discussion fora, chats and learning and social knowledge events to be scaled up effectively. This has always been a challenge for KM. The traditional focus on face-to-face events or shared lunches is incredibly worthwhile and valuable, but in large global organisations we do sometimes just need to scale that up in dispersed areas, and these tools do provide a way to make that much more effective. So now I'll be turning to more of the, shall we say, the nuts and bolts of the CC and how it actually works in practice. And first of all, I'm just showing you where the CC is in our current ITCMF framework. So you can see there it's under the heading of managing the IT capability. So it's very much part of IT capability in terms of organisational benefits that we'll be looking at. So what kind of approach did we take to actually updating the new CC? Well, we took, as normal, we took a mixture of different approaches to make sure that we got the best insights that we could from a good range of different sources. So clearly we, from previous colleagues, we had a great starting point of knowledge asset management CC, so that was our place where we started. We also had a fantastic group of practitioners and academics, the KM work group, who provided insights from their own experience over the years, so that was very valuable. We did a digital literature review, by which we mean we looked at where the academic and practitioner research has been done around KM since the last CC was done, and summarised from that the key challenges that we've been talking about today, and also importantly, evidence of what works in practice in terms of addressing them. And finally, as this is a work in progress, I presented it at a couple of European Conference for Knowledge Managements and got great feedback both from the peer reviewers of the paper and also the audience. So we're fairly confident that the content of the new CC is pretty robust from a range of different sources. So here we have just the definition of how we've defined KM. So the knowledge management KM capability is the ability to identify, capture, classify, analyse, share, and exploit knowledge to improve organisational performance. Again, just to reiterate that the all those activities are very valuable, but our focus is always on making sure they improve things for the organisation and actually do generate value and benefit. The aims and objectives, the goals and objectives of effective KM capability are to enable employees to capture, share, develop and leverage their collective knowledge to improve the performance of the business, to get the right knowledge to the right people at the right time and thereby improve the quality of decision making. And the third point here, not forgetting that the importance of knowledge assets, promote access to formalised documented knowledge and also to tacit and textual knowledge. So we address both knowledge in things such as documents and books and electronic sources, but also the fact that people hold a lot of knowledge, and we need to be aware of that too. We need to scan the business environment to identify relevant knowledge, and we have to organise and index the knowledge assets that we have. And finally and importantly, we need to keep track of the use and impact of knowledge in the organisation, and for that to be possible, we need to have some system of measurement and governance and strategy to make sure that we are measuring how we're getting on with using knowledge and what kind of difference that it's making. So this slide here shows you the structure of the new CC. It depicts the different capability elements. So you can see that this time around we have two main categories, which are building KM capability and leveraging KM capability. So just perhaps to explain the rationale behind that briefly, the basis of these is to emphasize that effective KM requires both setting up the backbone or infrastructure of KM, so that's building KM capability, and also developing the capability to exploit and gain value from KM, and that's leveraging KM capability. So we've kind of called them out in naming those categories to make it clear that they're the two key areas that need to be worked on. And then underneath them are various different capability building blocks looking at more specific areas such as knowledge analysis, governance, or tools and technologies. The toolkit that we've developed for our new KMCC is, some of you will be more or less familiar with these from previous CCs, is the four main artifacts, the questionnaire, and the purpose of that is to assess both current and desired capability maturity, so to give organisations a picture of where they are now and where they would like to be. We also have a master deck, which is essentially a communication tool, which introduces the critical capability, the key things that it covers, and some background ideas about it. We have a practice outcome metrics, which should be summarised to be called POMs. They provide guidance on maturity improvement by giving specific practices that we know from research can improve KM, and also give organisations some outcomes and metrics they can use, as we discussed earlier, to measure the effect those practices are having. So the POMs are very much a how-to guide to take people on the next step for their improvement planning. And finally, we have what we call a critical capability position paper, which is really a fairly brief and summarised overview of the CC topic in general. So that's an introduction to KM and a summary of the key changes or insights from the academic and practitioner literature and how they've impacted KM, and also, as I've highlighted earlier, some guidance on practices that work, also informed by evidence. So both insights into what's changed and some review of practices that have been shown to work in other organisations. So I'm now going to just have a quick overview, a summarised overview of the type of challenges that we've been talking about and how our KMCC has responded to them. So what I'm going to focus on really is this whole issue of how to embed a culture which values knowledge and learning. So clearly all of the parts of the KMCC help organisations get better at KM, otherwise we wouldn't have included them, but for the purposes of this morning's webinar, I think it's more useful to focus on one of them and show how that might work, and then clearly you can see how that would also work with the other ones. So we're going to start with the whole issue of we would need to respond to the speed of change in the environment, and to do that we need to make sure we have a culture which values knowledge and learning. So here we can see it here. So other CPBs that we could use are important, but as I said, we're going to focus on this one of culture. So I'll now go through in more detail how this capability building block can help organisations get better at promoting KM culture. So firstly, we have the questionnaire, which we mentioned earlier in our artifact deck. So this is a worked example using the culture capability building block. So as we mentioned, the questionnaire provides you a snapshot of what maturity in KM culture looks like at 5 different levels. Now the key advantage of this is that not only does it give you a picture of where you are, but instantly you can see, if you look at levels 4 and 5, how you could be better, even if you know in yourself that you're not actually there yet. So it gives a more objective way of assessing current maturity, because everyone's looking at the same questionnaire, and it also provides a picture of how you might want to get better by showing you the higher levels of maturity. And after your current and target maturity has been assessed, you'll then be moving on more to an improvement planning process. And as we mentioned, the practices and outcomes and metrics would be a very useful tool to do that. They provide guidance on improvement and the monitoring progress. So here we see examples of the practice of KM culture, both at level 2, when we're talking about fairly straightforward and simple communications to staff about how we think KM is probably quite important and what we want them to do. And then moving on to a far more advanced level at level 4, when we have an active and visible senior management support and championing of KM. And then in those practices, so you can see really quite quickly what you need to be doing to get to the high level of maturity, what it looks like, and also you've got some useful outcomes and metrics that, if you wish, clearly you can adapt to your own organisation, but they would help you to provide evidence that you are indeed implementing that practice and it's having the outcomes that you would like it to. So now, from that particular example, looking at the CBB of KM culture, this is a more general slide which shows you the KM sample assessment output. So that means someone has done the questionnaire on all the different capability building blocks, and this slide here shows them how they're scoring on all these different capability building blocks. So we can see them listed there on the right hand side of the slide. Culture is the first one, and then relationships going on down the slide. So the important thing to understand from this slide is that it's an attempt to show people both the areas of KM, the CBBs, that are important to them, so that's the strategy side of things. They've been identified by the different people who've answered the questionnaire as being important for the organisation, and also the maturity gap. So what kind of distance do we have between our understanding of our current maturity and our aim for where we would like to be? So the things that we need to focus on in terms of getting better at KM would be those that we see here in the upper right-hand quadrant. So they're areas of KM that we've both agreed are important for the organisation, and also we can see quite a big maturity gap between where we are and where we would like to be. So they're priority areas that we need to do better at, is one way of saying it in summary. So this slide gives organisations a picture of their current state and where they would like to be and how important it is for them to improve. And also to reiterate that key feedback we have had over the years from different ITCMF users is the usefulness of prioritising where to start, because it can be rather overwhelming to try and get better at any area of organisational activity. So this is the aim of this output, is to show you that these is what you need to get going on straight away, and the other stuff you do want to look at, but let's start with what's most important and where we have the biggest gap to address. So now, finally, we're coming to the end of my input to this webinar, but I think it's important to maybe finish with an overview of what are the benefits of KM and why do we think it's important to get better at KM and improve our capability. Now, I think one useful approach to look at this question is, well, we can explore the benefits of KM if we consider what happens if maybe we don't manage knowledge effectively in our organisation. What would be the worst thing that could happen, so to speak? And as Plato is telling us here, well, he thinks the most really dangerous, or the reprehensible indeed, thing to do is to think you know about things that you don't really know about. And I think this is certainly wisdom that we can learn from in our modern digital environment, that we need to be clear on the boundaries of our knowledge. We need to be confident that we have a good strategic sense of what our organisation does need to know, and we need to be confident that we have got the mechanisms and management systems in place to ensure that we do know them. And we can only really do this if we manage knowledge effectively. We certainly can't leave it to chance or individual activities. And if we don't manage to do this, then we'll probably be buffeted by changes around the organisation, and it'll only be by luck that we manage to respond in the right way, and luck eventually runs out. So I think getting better at KM reduces these risks and puts organisations in a good position to succeed and thrive in the digital world. And just my final slide here is just for people who would like some further information. This is not a completely comprehensive list of publications, but it would be a useful place to start. So, as I discussed, we've presented our work at 2 different European Conferences on Knowledge Management, and people are welcome to have a look at these documents here, which outline the work as it was a work in progress. Just to reiterate, all these documents are open access from the Maynooth University ePrints archive, and the links are given for you here. And also, as I mentioned, the white paper, which is a good overview and explanation of the key areas of KM in the digital context.